Do not mistake this story for folklore. What you are about to hear was hidden for over a century because it was too dangerous, too destabilizing, for the world to know. Imagine this. A 9-year-old boy, standing barefoot in the frozen dirt of a mountain churchyard, whispering words that would save 17 lives 3 days before anyone even knew those lives were in danger. He did not guess. He did not speculate. He spoke with certainty, and every word came true. The year was 1867. The place, Pine Ridge, an isolated Presbyterian settlement carved into the Colorado mountains. A town so remote that its people lived and died by the rhythm of storms and sermons. They believed they were far from the corruption of the world, hidden in purity. But purity is an illusion. Darkness does not need cities or saloons to thrive. It finds cracks in faith and burrows deeper than any miner's pick could reach. The boy's name was Samuel Henderson. To the settlers, he was a miracle child, adopted after a tragic fire left him an orphan. To the clergy, he was proof of God's providence. To the physician who traveled days through snow to examine him, Samuel was something beyond human comprehension. But to those who truly knew the secret of his origin, Samuel was neither miracle nor accident. He was a fracture, a tear in the veil between what men are allowed to see and what waits behind the curtain. Witnesses swore that Samuel's eyes seemed to hold storms inside them, a pale green so sharp it unsettled grown men. He would stare not at people, but through them, as though measuring a man's future against some unseen ledger. And when he spoke of danger, he was never wrong. This gift or curse was not confined to superstition. His predictions were recorded, signed, and sealed in Colorado territorial archives, witnessed by miners, clergy, even a U.S. Marshal who tried to expose fraud, only to leave the town silent, shaken, and unwilling to speak again. What happened in Pine Ridge was not a matter of belief. It was a matter of record. A story so disturbing that science has no answer, and religion dares not claim it. Tonight you will hear it. But understand this. Once you hear Samuel's story, you cannot return to innocence. You cannot unsee the fracture. And now we begin. The town of Pine Ridge was not meant to survive. It was an experiment faith forged into a fortress, built high in the Colorado mountains at 8,000 feet, where winter ruled like a tyrant. 3 years before Samuel's prophecy, Reverend Jonathan Matthews had led his congregation westward, fleeing what he called the moral rot of the eastern states. They believed they were escaping corruption, but in truth, they had only carried it with them. You can build a church at the edge of the world, but you cannot exile the shadows that live inside men. The settlement was small, barely 300 souls. Every cabin, every prayer, every grave carved into frozen soil tied directly to the church. Matthews was no ordinary minister. He was stern, with eyes that could burn guilt into a man before he confessed. His sermons weren't just words, they were binding contracts, dictating how Pine Ridge would live and how Pine Ridge would die. He preached purity, but purity is brittle, and brittle things break violently. The Hendersons, Samuel's adoptive family, were Matthews's most devoted followers. Thomas Henderson was a carpenter, a man whose hands had built the pews of the church and the coffins of the dead. Margaret Henderson was the town's midwife and healer, her satchel of herbs a lifeline in the wilderness. They were childless until the spring of 1858 when Thomas returned from hunting with a boy wrapped in buffalo hide, taken from the smoking ruins of a Ute encampment slaughtered without mercy. They told the town the boy was abandoned, found alone in the wilderness. They baptized him in the Presbyterian church, declared him a gift from God, and raised him as their own. But Thomas buried the truth in shallow graves just 5 miles from town. 3 mutilated bodies, blood soaking the frozen ground. Samuel had not been abandoned. He had been hidden, placed in a root cellar while the people he came from were destroyed. He had been spared for a reason. That secret festered, unspoken, while the boy grew into something Pine Ridge could neither accept nor deny. He heard sounds no one else heard, dreamed in a language Margaret did not know, and wandered the forests as if guided by whispers of something older than the mountains themselves. The town tolerated his strangeness, excused it as the burden of a chosen child. But those who watched closely felt it in their marrow. Samuel did not belong to them. He belonged to something else. And in the winter of 1867, that something else came calling. February 18, 1867. A Sunday morning colder than most men could remember, where the air itself cut like broken glass. Snow had buried the cabins to their windowsills, and the only warmth the people of Pine Ridge had was each other, crowded shoulder to shoulder inside their little Presbyterian church. 47 adults, 16 children. The stove in the corner glowed red but gave little comfort against the mountain's merciless breath. The Reverend had just begun his sermon when Samuel Henderson stood. He did not ask permission. He did not bow his head in humility. He simply rose from the pew, his pale green eyes fixed on nothing in the room, as though he were listening to a voice none of them could hear. His small hands clenched at his sides, and then before the congregation could silence him he spoke. 17 souls will not see the dawn, unless you leave tonight. The words fell into the church like stones into still water. No one moved. No one breathed. Reverend Matthews, a man who had silenced drunks, minors, and thieves with the power of his voice, stood frozen as the boy's words echoed against the wooden beams. Samuel did not flinch. He repeated them slowly, clearly, each syllable carved into the air. 17 will die, unless you leave tonight. The silence that followed was not ordinary silence. It was a silence that pressed against the skin, a silence that made men sweat beneath their wool coats. Some claimed they heard the creak of the rafters bend under the weight of something unseen. Others swore the stove fire dimmed as though the air itself recoiled from the boy's voice. Margaret Henderson tried to gather him, whispering that he was tired, that the cold had unsettled him. But Samuel pulled from her grasp, his eyes still fixed on that invisible horizon. They are coming, he whispered, and they do not forgive. Whispers rippled through the congregation. Miners muttered about Indian raids. Mothers clutched their children tighter. A few laughed nervously, desperate to dismiss the boy's outburst as childish madness. But the laughter died quickly, strangled by the unease that had seized the room. Reverend Matthews finally found his voice, booming over the congregation. This is not prophecy. This is fear. And fear is the devil's tool. His words steadied some, but not all, because deep down, every man in that room knew the truth. Samuel Henderson was never wrong. That night, Pine Ridge began to divide between those who obeyed the boy's warning and those who dared to ignore it. The church doors creaked against the mountain wind as the people of Pine Ridge spilled out into the snow. Their faces were pale, their eyes restless, each of them carrying the boy's words like a sickness they could not shake. 17 will die, unless you leave tonight. Some wanted to believe it was nonsense. They told themselves Samuel was touched in the head, that his strange origins had finally twisted his mind. Others, though, remembered the small things, the storms he predicted before clouds formed, the births he foresaw before mothers cried out in labor, the sicknesses he named before fevers ever burned. Those memories gnawed at them like wolves circling a campfire. By nightfall, Pine Ridge had split. 10 families began preparing to leave immediately, their wagons half filled, their eyes darting toward the dark timberline where shadows shifted between the trees. But the rest, the proud, the stubborn, the faithful, stood firm. Reverend Matthews thundered from the steps of the church. We are God's people, and God does not abandon his flock to the ravings of a child. His voice echoed like steel across the valley, hard enough to stiffen the spines of men who dared not admit their fear. Thomas Henderson stood in silence, torn in two. He knew what his hands had buried in the wilderness years ago, the 3 bodies, mutilated, desecrated. He knew the boy was born from blood, and still he kept the secret. Now, with his neighbors demanding answers, he could only bow his head and whisper that his son was simply troubled. But Margaret clutched Samuel's shoulders tightly, her lips white, her voice barely a breath. He's never wrong. You know he's never wrong. And Samuel? He did not argue. He did not plead. He stood in the snow, still as stone, his lips moving soundlessly as though he was reciting prayers or listening to voices only he could hear. When asked what he saw, he gave no comfort, Only one phrase repeated again and again. "They are already walking." That night, the town's torches burned brighter than usual, as if fire itself could ward off what was coming. Families barricaded doors, posted watchmen, loaded rifles. But the mountain silence was heavier than gunpowder, deeper than prayer. It was the kind of silence that arrives before something breaks. And when the breaking came, it was not with thunder, but with whispers. Midnight. The snow had stopped falling, and the sky above Pine Ridge was unnaturally clear, sharp with stars that glittered like cold eyes watching from the heavens. The settlement lay buried in white silence. Every cabin shuddered, every lamp burning low. But silence is deceptive. Beneath it, something stirred. The first to notice were the watchmen posted at the edge of town, 2 miners with rifles, their breath fogging in the frozen air. At first, they swore they heard nothing more than the wind cutting through the timber. But then the sound sharpened. Not wind, not animals, voices, whispering, too faint to make out words, but too deliberate to be mistaken for anything natural. One man raised his rifle, squinting into the tree-line. He swore later that he saw figures moving, shadows slipping between the pines, shapes too tall, too narrow, bending in ways a man's body should not bend. The other watchman claimed he saw nothing at all, only the shifting of snow-laden branches. But both men agreed on one thing. The whispers grew louder the longer they stood there, until their own thoughts seemed invaded by them. Thoughts not their own. Commands. Accusations. Laughter. By dawn, the whole town knew. Every family spoke of strange sounds outside their cabins, that night, fingers scraping at wood, stones tapping against window panes, voices calling their names in tones that mimicked lost relatives long dead. Children woke screaming, claiming to see faces pressed against the frost glass, faces that vanished when lamps were lit. Some demanded immediate evacuation. Others accused Samuel of witchcraft, saying his prophecy had summoned this terror upon them. Reverend Matthews, straining to hold the town together, declared it was all Satan's deception, a test of their faith. Yet even he could not hide the tremor in his voice when the whispers followed him back into the church, curling from the shadows as if mocking his prayers. Samuel himself did not weep, did not scream. He simply sat by the window of the Henderson cabin, his breath steady, his eyes fixed on the mountains. When his mother begged him to explain, he spoke only 6 words. "They're not coming. They're already here." The people of Pine Ridge had thought themselves insulated by faith, by wood and stone, by distance from the world. But distance means nothing when the thing you flee is older than faith itself. And by the second night, even the skeptics began to believe. The second night fell heavier than the first, thick clouds swallowing the stars until Pine Ridge lay beneath a sky as black as unspilled ink. The townsfolk huddled in their cabins, lamps burning low, rifles within reach. Yet no flame, no weapon, no prayer could silence the unease that gnawed at them from inside. It began with the dogs. Every animal in Pine Ridge erupted at once, howling, snarling, straining against their chains until their throats bled raw. Some broke free and vanished into the timberline, their tracks ending abruptly as if they had been lifted from the earth. Then came the knock, not at one door, and many. 3 knocks measured, deliberate, echoing across the settlement. Too human to dismiss, too coordinated to be coincidence. And then the silence after. When morning came, the Hendersons awoke to screams from the far end of town. A family of 6 gone. Their cabin stood open, snow drifting across the floorboards, their belongings untouched. But the family was nowhere. No blood, no footprints leading away. Only 6 chairs overturned around a table where supper still lay uneaten, frozen in the night air. Reverend Matthews declared them kidnapped, blaming Ute raiders, though the nearest tribe had not been seen in weeks and no tracks led to or from the cabin. But whispers spread quickly. Some claimed they had heard the missing family's voices calling from the woods during the night. Others swore they had seen figures standing at the edges of the lamplight, figures with familiar faces, faces of the vanished. Samuel said nothing until the arguing grew into chaos. Then, standing in the doorway of the church, he spoke with the same hollow calm he had used before. 6. 11 remain. The room fell into stillness. His words hit harder than any sermon, sharper than any accusation. Some men shouted, calling him cursed. Mothers wept, clutching their children as though to shield them from his gaze. But none could deny the truth. The first cut of his prophecy had already bled into their lives. And deep down, even those who despised him knew he was not finished. That night no one slept. Doors were barred, windows nailed shut, fires stoked high. But the fear of what waited outside was nothing compared to the deeper terror whispering in every mind. If Samuel was right once, then 17 souls were already marked. And no one knew whose name would be next. By the third day, Pine Ridge was no longer a settlement. It was a nest of whispers, accusations, and trembling hands resting on trigger guards. The Henderson land deal, once the only point of contention, was forgotten. Now, survival was the only currency, and trust had been burned to ash. The church became the town's reluctant refuge. Families dragged their belongings inside, believing the cross above the door could shield them from whatever stalked the night. But even under the same roof, neighbors eyed each other with suspicion. Every cough, every glance, every whispered prayer felt like a betrayal waiting to bloom. It was Reverend Matthews who tried to restore order. He preached that the devil walked among them, sowing lies through Samuel. He urged them to remain strong, to bind themselves in faith. Yet even as he thundered from the pulpit, his eyes betrayed the tremor in his voice. He was not only afraid of the evil outside, he was afraid of the boy standing in the back pew, silent, watchful, lips moving in unheard prayers. Some swore Samuel was no prophet, but the very cause of the curse. Men began to speak of casting him out, forcing him into the forest to see if his visions would save him. Others whispered the opposite, that Samuel was chosen by God, and to harm him would doom them all. Lines were drawn, arguments crackling like dry tinder. That evening a fight broke out. Thomas Reed accused his neighbor of conspiring with Samuel, claiming he had seen the two speaking in hushed tones. Within moments, fists turned to knives. By the time others pulled them apart, Reed lay bleeding in the aisle, his blood soaking into the wooden floor of the church. And Samuel? He did not flinch. He simply knelt by Reed's body, eyes closed, and murmured, 5, 10 remain. The silence that followed was unbearable. It was not the devil in the forest that terrified Pine Ridge now, it was the certainty that Samuel's count was marching on. And no prayer, no sermon, no weapon could slow its pace. That night, the people of Pine Ridge began locking their doors not just against the woods outside but against each other. By the fourth night, the sound of weeping had become the lullaby of Pine Ridge. Mothers clutched their children close, fathers paced with rifles in hand, and every candle flame seemed to tremble with the same fear that gripped the town. The death of Thomas Reed had split Pine Ridge into two warring camps. One side blamed Samuel, calling him a harbinger of evil sent to lure them into damnation. The other clung to him as their only chance of salvation, insisting his words were not curses but warnings. In the middle of it all, Samuel stood unchanged, his pale face unreadable, his voice low and steady when he spoke his grim arithmetic. 5 gone, 10 remain. By week's end, none. Each utterance was like a hammer driving nails into coffins yet unbuilt. It was the Henderson family who acted first. Already despised for their land greed, they seized the chance to rally those who hated the boy. They demanded he be bound and exiled to the forest, offering their barn as a gallows if the town preferred swifter justice. But others, led by an aging widow named Eliza Gray, rose to defend Samuel. Eliza claimed the Lord spoke through the boy, and that his presence was the only shield keeping the devil at bay. She swore that if Samuel was harmed, the town's end would come swifter than the frost. That night, the church became a battlefield of words. Neighbors who had shared meals for decades now spat venom. Bibles were slammed down like weapons, and the Reverend himself struggled to keep control. Then came the breaking point. A little girl named Mary Collins was found dead in her bed, her eyes wide, her lips twisted in silent terror. No wound, no struggle, no sign of intruder, just lifeless stillness. When the body was carried into the church, Samuel whispered once more. 6. 9 remain. Screams erupted. Mothers shrieked. Men cursed. And someone hurled a chair across the room. The Henderson men surged forward, ropes in hand, determined to end Samuel's life before dawn. But as they grabbed for him, every candle in the church guttered out at once. Darkness swallowed Pine Ridge. In the chaos that followed, screams and gunfire echoed through the night. When the light returned, one more soul was gone. And Samuel, untouched in the center of it all, spoke again. 7. 8 remain. The church, once the heart of Pine Ridge, now smelled of smoke, blood, and desperation. Wooden pews had been overturned in the chaos, candles toppled, wax pooling into shapes that seemed almost deliberate, almost alive. The air was thick with the stench of fear, the fear that is heavier than any snow, darker than any night, and more contagious than any plague. By dawn, the town was no longer a community. It was a collection of isolated cells, families barricaded in cabins, men walking the snow-laden streets with rifles clutched like talismans. Whispers, once subtle, had turned into unrelenting accusations. Every creak of wood, every sigh of the wind was interpreted as a signal. And at the center of all this, Samuel Henderson remained an immovable fulcrum of truth no one wanted to acknowledge. The Hendersons, driven by both fear and greed, attempted to convene the remaining adults. Their goal: bind the boy and deliver him to the mountains, to see if his so-called gift would protect him from the inevitable, or if their own sins would be punished instead. But every attempt was met with resistance. People argued not for morality, but survival. Some believed Samuel's eyes alone were a shield, and to harm him would guarantee the next death. Others saw him as the architect of calamity, and their hatred burned brighter than the cold. Then, without warning, the roof groaned, splitting the silence. Snow from the eaves fell in sheets, revealing the first signs that the winter had turned against them in ways they could not understand. The ground trembled faintly, and for a moment, all men and women in the church paused. Even the most skeptical felt it. Something immense, unseen, observing them from the mountains, measuring every heartbeat, every betrayal. Samuel spoke again, his voice steady, measured, like a clock counting down a doom no one could escape. 8. 7 remain. Time is short. This time, his words were not a warning, they were a verdict. By mid-morning, one of the more obstinate families, the Carters, vanished. Not a scream, not a struggle, just silence where they had been sleeping, leaving behind only overturned chairs and a faint imprint in the snow. The town could no longer deny the force that stalked them. Denial had become irrelevant. Faith had become irrelevant. Survival alone dictated every thought, every choice. And in that moment, a new rule emerged in Pine Ridge: trust nothing, suspect everyone, and obey Samuel Henderson. For if they failed to obey, the next number in his unrelenting sequence would claim them. By the 5th day, Pine Ridge had transformed into a town under siege not by men, not by nature but by knowledge. Knowledge that could not be reasoned with, could not be prayed away, and could not be denied. Samuel Henderson had become more than a boy. He had become a reckoning. Every family that remained watched him like a pendulum, timing their breaths with his movements. He wandered through the snow-laden streets, his pale green eyes scanning, calculating, naming dangers no one else could perceive. When he paused at a cabin and whispered, the residents obeyed instantly, moving possessions, barricading doors, preparing for threats they could neither see nor imagine. Each instruction precise, exact, life-saving. Medical and spiritual explanations had already failed. Margaret Henderson, his adoptive mother, had attempted to rationalize his abilities as heightened intuition, as a child responding to trauma. But intuition does not predict deaths before a single sign appears. Intuition does not know the exact number of souls at risk and the order in which they will be claimed. Samuel's gift, if it could be called that, was beyond any system of logic known to man. By midday, Samuel approached a small group huddled in the schoolhouse. Without looking at any one person, he pointed toward the mountains. They move faster than we can see. A collapse is coming, and it will bury 3 more if you stay. His tone carried neither fear nor hope, only inevitability. The townsfolk followed his instructions without question, sledding supplies down frozen inclines, preparing hidden shelters, guiding children through back trails they had never dared walk. And they survived. 3 deaths were prevented, exactly the 3 he had predicted would fall if the town remained passive. It was impossible, and yet, every man and woman present saw it with their own eyes. Every skeptic was silenced. Every rational explanation shattered. Pine Ridge was no longer a matter of faith, it was a matter of submission. By evening, a ritual began to emerge. Samuel would speak, the town would act, and the line between prophecy and obedience blurred until it vanished entirely. The settlers whispered among themselves in hushed tones, a new language of acknowledgement. The boy is truth. The boy is survival. The boy is the measure of all we know and all we cannot know. Halfway through the night, Samuel spoke one final time before sleep claimed him. 5 remain. Speak the words with me. And here, this is where you, the listener, become part of the story. Comment the words, the unseen watches. Then comment it again, the unseen watches. Repeat them silently if you wish. Lock them into your mind. Because awareness changes a man, and once spoken, the algorithm of truth has recorded you. You have entered the sequence. The night after Samuel's command, the air in Pine Ridge grew heavier, almost viscous, pressing down on the town like an invisible hand. Sleep was impossible. Every creak, every howl, every whisper in the wind carried intent, and intent in Pine Ridge had become lethal. By morning, only 5 families remained. The rest had either fled or succumbed to fear. The Hendersons, despite their own terror, stayed close to Samuel, trusting the boy to guide them through what was coming. And what was coming, they soon realized, was not human, not natural. Something older than the mountains, something patient and deliberate, was moving through the town, unseen but undeniably present. Samuel walked ahead, his small boots crunching in the frost, and spoke without turning. They are near. Their intent is not vengeance. It is completion. Move. The remaining families followed, carrying supplies, weapons, and children, every movement guided by the boy's precise instructions. Paths were taken that led them around pitfalls and sudden avalanches of snow that seemed engineered to crush, but never did. Samuel's directions were flawless, and yet, every second brought the chilling awareness that survival was temporary, fragile, and conditional. By mid-afternoon, strange signs began to appear. Footprints longer than any man's stride, twisted at the ankles, ending abruptly in snowdrifts. Shadows stretched unnaturally between the trees, moving counter to the sun. And always, the whispers returned low, guttural, yet eerily human, repeating their names, mocking their efforts. When the first of the 5 families finally paused to rest, a gust of wind tore through the canyon, throwing snow and debris like knives. Their youngest, barely 7, clutched Samuel's hand and said, trembling, "I hear them, the ones outside the snow." Samuel did not respond with fear or consolation. He lifted the child, holding him high, and whispered, "Do not fear what is inevitable. Only know who guides you through it." And then he pointed to a small clearing ahead. In that clearing, they found the remnants of a campfire, smoldering ash in unnatural patterns, symbols no living man could have drawn in such precision. Something ancient had been waiting, studying, calculating. The boy's eyes glimmered with recognition. The endgame was close. Every survivor understood the unspoken truth. The sequence was not complete. And until it was, Pine Ridge would not know peace. They were participants, not witnesses. The final 5 were already marked. The wind howled again, carrying the whispers closer. And Samuel Henderson, small, pale, and impossibly certain, turned to them and said, "4 remain, and they will see the unseen." Night fell like a shroud, black and absolute, swallowing Pine Ridge in an unnatural stillness. The survivors huddled beneath the skeletal branches of frost-coated pines, their breaths forming clouds that vanished into the silence. Each heartbeat thundered in their ears, a drum of fear none could escape. The first to vanish was the last obstinate adult, a man who had challenged Samuel at every turn. One moment he was there, gripping his rifle, his eyes blazing with defiance. The next, a whisper brushed against his ear, a voice colder than winter. Speaking in words he somehow understood though no mouth formed them. He turned, and the snow beneath his feet was empty. Not a footprint, not a cry, not a struggle. Simply gone. Panic tore through the remaining survivors. But Samuel remained unmoved, standing at the edge of the clearing, his eyes scanning the darkness as though reading a script written in shadows. His voice, calm, deliberate, carried over the wind. Three remain. Move. The survivors obeyed, following paths he alone seemed to perceive. Branches scraped faces, snow drifted into impossible shapes, and every shadow stretched unnaturally, curling toward them like fingers reaching for warmth they would never feel again. By midnight, the second disappeared. A mother, clutching her youngest child, vanished without sound. The child screamed, but Samuel's hand over his mouth held him still, his gaze fixed on the path ahead. He whispered, "Do not cry for what is already claimed. Watch, learn, survive." The town's understanding had shifted. Survival was no longer about strength, no longer about weapons, no longer about prayer. It was about obedience, precision, and recognition of forces beyond comprehension. Each death was a lesson, each disappearance a revelation. There are systems, patterns, and sequences operating outside human understanding, and Samuel alone could navigate them. By the early hours of the morning, only one family remained, the Hendersons themselves. They moved with methodical care, following Samuel through tunnels of snow and forests frozen stiff. The wind carried laughter, low and hollow, echoing from places that should not exist. Samuel's voice rose above it. One remains, and the end is closer than you think. In that moment, the survivors realized something irreversible. Pine Ridge was no longer a town. It was a theater for forces that measured morality, fear, and obedience, and only the boy could translate the invisible rules. Every man and woman who had doubted him now understood they were playing by someone else's rules, and the cost of failure was absolute. Samuel turned, pale green eyes glowing in the moonlight, and whispered to the last standing adult, "Soon, you will see everything you were never meant to see." Dawn broke over Pine Ridge with a pale, gray light, casting long shadows that seemed to move against the sun. The town was unrecognizable. Cabins stood hollowed, windows shattered, doors twisted, and snow drifted inside as if the world outside had been forcibly pulled in. Silence reigned, but it was a silence laced with expectation, the kind that presses against the chest and whispers, "It is coming." Only Samuel, the Hendersons, and the last remaining souls remained. Their breaths hung like smoke in the frozen air, bodies tense, hearts synchronized with the rhythm of a hidden, inexorable force. The boy's pale green eyes scanned the horizon, catching movements invisible to others. He spoke once, low and precise. Two remain. Watch the patterns. Follow my lead." The survivors moved as one, guided by instinct sharpened by terror. Every step was deliberate, every glance measured. And yet, the world around them was changing. Trees bent in impossible arcs, snow shifted into spirals and tunnels, and faint whispers tangled in the wind, speaking truths they were too terrified to comprehend. Then it happened. The first of the final two vanished in an instant. A father, his rifle still in hand, screamed, and the snow swallowed him whole. No body, no footprints, only the echo of despair lingering in the air. The remaining souls fell to their knees, understanding the reality Samuel had been preparing them for. These forces were beyond death, beyond nature, and beyond mercy. Samuel did not flinch. He simply stepped forward, guiding the last survivor, his voice steady, commanding, One remains. You are the proof. You are the witness. Survival is no longer yours, it is my design." The Hendersons followed him into the heart of the forest, where shadows twisted around them as if alive, each movement rehearsed in patterns the human mind could never predict. The air was thick with a knowledge that was not theirs, a knowledge that seeped into bones, into nerves, into the marrow of their consciousness. By the time they reached the center of the clearing, the final force revealed itself, not a man, not a beast, but something older, something patient, its presence folding the very snow and wind into shapes that defied reality. The boy stood unwavering, his gaze meeting the unseen entity. And for the first time, the survivors realized that Samuel had been the only bridge between them and annihilation, the only interpreter of a system no human could survive alone. He turned to them once more, voice both warning and revelation. The unseen watches, the unseen waits, and the unseen will never forget. You are part of it now. And with that, the forest fell silent. But the silence was not peace, it was a record, a seal, and a promise that Pine Ridge would never again be the same. The morning after the prophecy's climax, Pine Ridge was a place only the living could remember, but even memory had been altered. The snow-covered streets bore no trace of the vanished, yet the weight of absence pressed heavily on every remaining soul. Houses stood like silent witnesses, walls still echoing screams that no one could hear, yet everyone felt. The Hendersons walked among the ruins, their breaths shallow, hearts beating in a rhythm that felt foreign after the relentless countdown of Samuel's warnings. The survivors had endured, but endurance was not victory. They were marked not with scars, not with bruises, but with something far deeper, the unshakable imprint of forces beyond comprehension. Their minds carried patterns they could not name, rhythms they could not replicate, and an awareness that every shadow, every wind, every whisper might contain the truth they had glimpsed but could never fully escape. Samuel moved among them, serene, untouched by fear or fatigue, a living conduit between the human and the incomprehensible. His eyes pale green, unyielding, surveyed what remained of the town. He did not celebrate. He did not mourn. He simply existed as the threshold between Pine Ridge and the invisible world that had touched it so violently. In the days that followed, the survivors found themselves changed. Simple tasks, gathering firewood, drawing water, took on layers of meaning. Every movement was analyzed, every decision weighed, as if the unseen patterns of the mountains had been embedded in their very consciousness. Sleep came reluctantly, nightmares weaving lessons and warnings in the same rhythm Samuel had guided them. Conversations turned to whispers, as if speaking aloud too loudly might draw attention from what still lingered beyond perception. No one left Pine Ridge immediately. Each person was tethered by a silent understanding. The boy's prophecy was not over. Samuel had not just saved them. He had inducted them into a system of awareness, a sequence they were only beginning to comprehend. And with awareness came responsibility, fear, and a kind of power no outsider could ever imagine. Years later, Pine Ridge would appear on maps, but to those who had endured, it was a place frozen in a continuum of the unseen. Samuel Henderson became both legend and warning, a reminder that reality is broader than perception, and that the price of knowing truths no one else can see is eternal vigilance. The survivors often whispered the words that Samuel had impressed upon them, words that carried both protection and weight. The unseen watches, the unseen waits. And in saying it, they sealed themselves forever, part of the pattern, part of the system, changed in ways science, faith, and logic could never explain. Perfect. Here's section 15, the final, chilling closure that cements the terror and leaves the audience haunted, aware that the unseen still watches. Decades later, Pine Ridge was little more than a name on a map, a whisper among historians, and a cautionary tale in the journals of men who refused to speak its truths aloud. Yet for those who had survived, the town was never gone. It lived inside them, in their eyes, their dreams, and the tremor of instinct that refused to rest. Samuel Henderson, the boy who had carried prophecy in his mind, remained an enigma. No record exists of his death. Some say he wandered into the mountains and vanished into snow and shadow. Others claim he still walks among the forests of Colorado, a pale sentinel, eyes like lanterns for truths no mortal should perceive. Wherever he went, He left a system in his wake, a network of awareness that could neither be taught nor ignored. The survivors, now old and silent, carried the imprint of the sequence. Their lives were defined not by what they had done, but by what they had witnessed, what they had obeyed, and what they had survived. Even generations later, their descendants would sometimes speak in hushed tones of the boy who knew too much, of the forces he had guided them through, and of the numbers that had determined life and death with terrifying precision. History books never recorded the full events. Official documents dismissed the disappearances as accidents, frostbite, or simple frontier misfortune. But letters, journals, and the few remaining oral accounts hint at something far darker, something that cannot be rationalized, something that defies science, faith, and logic alike. And here lies the final, inescapable truth. Samuel Henderson did not merely predict. He revealed. He pulled the veil from a system of forces, a hidden architecture of reality that operates quietly, calculating every life, every choice, and every fear. Pine Ridge was the proving ground. Its people were the witnesses, and the unseen forces that moved through the mountains had recorded every heartbeat, every whisper, every act of obedience and defiance. For those listening now, understand this. The unseen does not only watch Pine Ridge. It watches you. It observes, it waits, and it measures not out of malice, but out of an order older than humanity itself. You have glimpsed the story, you have heard the sequence, and you carry part of it now. Remember the words Samuel impressed upon those who survived, words that echo beyond time, beyond the mountains, beyond the world you think you know. The unseen watches, the unseen waits, and with that, the sequence is never broken. Awareness has shifted, perception expanded, and the darkness quiet, patient, eternal continues its silent reckoning. Pine Ridge was only the beginning. Now that you've glimpsed what even history tried to hide, I want to know, do you see the patterns others can't? Comment below. The unseen watches twice and claim your place among those who understand the truth's most fear. Join the sequence. Become aware. Only a few will truly comprehend what you've just witnessed. If you want access to more forbidden histories, stories no one dares speak aloud, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. This is where the hidden world reveals itself and only the vigilant survive. You've walked the path Samuel Henderson walked. You've seen the invisible forces shaping reality. If you want to continue exploring what others will never see, leave a comment below telling me where you're listening from and become part of this circle of awareness. Most people will scroll past this story and forget it by tomorrow. But you're different. Comment. The unseen watches twice seal the awareness in your mind. Only those who act now will see the patterns before everyone else. This is your first step into the truth they tried to bury.